At first light, the mass in northeastern Wyoming does not look like a mountain. It looks cut. A dark cylinder of stone rises out of grassland and pine, its sides split into long vertical columns, its summit strangely level, its base ringed with broken fragments as if something immense once sheared away and collapsed around it. From a distance, Devil's Tower is not just tall, it is specific. It resembles an object more than a landscape, a form with edges, a surface with grain. The prairie around it only sharpens the contradiction. There is empty space, low horizon, open sky, and then this, a blunt, towering column that seems less deposited than left behind. What exactly are you looking at? The official explanation is familiar, and much of it is solid. The tower is described as an igneous intrusion, about a mass of molten rock that cooled underground roughly 50 to 60 million years ago, and was later exposed when softer sedimentary layers eroded away. The stone itself is phonolite porphyry. Its vertical faces are explained by columnar jointing, a known process in which cooling rock contracts, fractures, and forms polygonal columns, often hexagonal, sometimes five-sided, sometimes irregular. The broader region preserves marine sediments, ancient shorelines, uplift, and long erosion. In that account, there is no mystery in the object itself, only in the fine details of how one volcanic event took one exact shape. And yet the official explanation arrives with a hesitation that matters. Even the record concedes uncertainty. Geologists agree that the tower began as magma, but they have not settled the exact mechanism. Stock, laccolith, volcanic neck, maar diatreme. The labels shift, the diagrams change, the thing remains. That does not mean the geology is false, it means the confidence people hear in the summary is often larger than the confidence inside the archive. And once you begin noticing that gap, another question emerges. Why do certain formations around the world keep presenting themselves in the same visual language? Flat tops, fluted sides, radial ridges, shattered aprons at the base, and silhouettes that look less like random terrain than the severed remains of something once vertical, fibrous, and alive. The hidden theory is not that every mountain is secretly a tree. That is the cartoon version, and it is easy to dismiss. The more serious possibility is narrower and harder to wave away. Harder is that some formations we classify as purely geological may preserve the mineralized architecture of an older biological world at scales modern intuition no longer accepts. Not all, perhaps not many, but enough to force a second look. The theory does not begin with fantasy. It begins with a problem of category. When tissue becomes stone, when form survives but composition changes, when erosion removes context and institutions inherit settled labels, what remains may be filed under geology, even if the original story was more complicated. The first obstacle is scale, because modern scale controls belief. A skyscraper feels possible, a tree twice that height does not, but the accepted world is already larger than common memory allows. Coast redwoods can approach 370 feet. Giant sequoias can exceed 300 feet. With trunk diameters of 16 to 20 feet and sometimes far more. Old photographs do not show dainty trees enlarged by camera tricks. They show men standing on stumps broad enough to host gatherings, soldiers sitting inside fallen trunks, crews balanced on springboards, soaring through wood as wide as a room. Houses were built into stump cavities in the American Northwest because the stumps were large enough to inhabit. Once that scale is admitted, something shifts. The issue is no longer whether giant trees existed. The record shows they did. The issue becomes how far beyond modern forest baselines ancient growth may once have gone under different atmospheric, climatic, and ecological conditions. That matters because the Earth also preserves forests in stone. Petrified Forest National Park does not describe a metaphor. However, it describes wood transformed by minerals, organic structure replaced over long spans by silica until logs become quartz. Yellowstone preserves upright fossil forests. Other sites preserve stumps, roots, bark textures, and entire buried woodland systems. The process is established. Wood can mineralize, cellular form can persist after substance changes. The result can fracture with clean, almost artificial geometry. Park records even address a recurring public reaction directly. Visitors see evenly broken, petrified trunks and ask who cut the wood. The answer is stress, uplift, quartz brittleness, and time. But notice what that answer quietly confirms. A biological form can pass so deeply into stone that later observers mistake it for fabrication. What changed was the explanation. Hamish now placed that against formations that looked less like fallen trunks and more like standing stumps. Devil's Tower rises 867 feet above its base, and its columns can stretch hundreds of feet high and up to roughly 10 feet wide. The summit is broad and relatively level. Broken columns lie in heaps around the base. The surface runs in vertical lines. None of that is secret. It is the standard description. The mainstream interpretation says those lines are cooling fractures in igneous rock, not grain, not vascular channels, not anything biological. Fair enough. But the visual resemblance is not superficial because one or two people on the internet said so. It is structural, cylinder, crown removed, splintered base, column bundles. The reason the comparison persists is not only because the public is gullible, and it is because the object keeps presenting the same physical cues. This is the point where the mainstream explanation deserves to be stated carefully because it explains a great deal. Columnar jointing is real. It forms when lava or magma cools, contracts, and fractures into prismatic patterns. Most columns are hexagonal because stress is efficiently relieved by cracks intersecting at roughly 120 degrees, though columns can have 3 to 7 sides and often vary. They form perpendicular to cooling surfaces. Similar structures appear at Devil's Postpile, in basalt cliffs, in lava fields, and across volcanic provinces around the world. The tower is composed of igneous rock, not preserved cellulose. Under a microscope, geologists do not report bark, rings, vessels, or woody tissue. That is important. And any theory that ignores these facts is not an investigation, it is a performance. But what the standard model does not fully settle is the broader pattern of resemblance across scales and landscapes, especially when public explanation stops at mineral type and never returns to morphology. There are mesas, buttes, plugs, monoliths, and columned outcrops whose profiles repeatedly converge on the same stump-like geometry. There are radial drainage patterns around isolated high points that resemble root flare to the naked eye, though hydrology will interpret them differently. There are broad, flat erosional surfaces capping isolated masses like cut tops. There are debris fields at the base that read like shattered fibers. Geology can explain these things separately. The question is whether the category itself has become so strong that no one is rewarded for asking whether a few cases deserve cross-disciplinary inspection beyond the usual volcanic template. Then there is timing. Modern geology matured by dividing the Earth into clean domains: rock, fossil, mineral, strata, uplift, erosion. That separation was powerful. It made prediction possible. It made mapping possible. It also made certain mixed cases harder to see. If a structure began as organic matter, was rapidly mineralized, thermally altered, compressed, intruded upon, and later exposed by tens of millions of years of erosion, what discipline owns it? A paleobotanist would look for cellular evidence. A petrologist would look at crystal composition. A geomorphologist would map weathering. A mining survey would classify extractable material. A monument office would interpret public safety and tourism. In that chain, anything that does not fit cleanly is usually not hidden by a dramatic conspiracy. It is buried by procedure, by definitions, by the limits of accepted categories. The pattern widens when you move away from a single icon. Once you start cataloguing forms by silhouette rather than by official label, repetition becomes difficult to ignore. There are towers with fluted sides and leveled tops. There are isolated buttes standing in flat basins like cut posts. There are petrified forests with upright stumps frozen in mineral replacement. There are plateau edges scalloped like torn organic material, and ridge lines that branch like root systems when seen from satellite elevation models. Most of these are almost certainly geological in the ordinary sense. I know that is not the point. The point is that the same visual grammar appears again and again across landscapes classified under separate mechanisms. The pattern does not disappear simply because some examples have ordinary explanations. Repetition is not proof. But repetition is how serious questions begin. Old photographs deepen the unease because they reveal how quickly scale can be normalized and then forgotten. 19th century and early 20th century logging images show men posing on sequoia stumps wider than houses, groups standing inside hollowed trunks, entire sections of forest converted into impossible-looking cut surfaces. At the time, these images were not occult evidence. They were industry records, postcards, engineering problems, trophies of extraction. The trees were large enough to require springboards just to begin the cut above the buttress base. Large enough that judging the direction of fall became a major operation. Large enough that the destruction itself altered local memory. By the mid-20th century, most old-growth redwood forest had already been erased. Once the biggest living examples are gone, the imagination shrinks with them. The archive remains, but belief changes. The stone remembers. Another piece of the puzzle lies in materials usually discussed for entirely different reasons. Coal seams, lignite beds, buried peats, fossilized plant mats, and ancient forest deposits all testify to biomass accumulation on scales modern ecosystems rarely match. That does not prove kilometer-high trunks. It does establish that the planet has supported botanical abundance far beyond contemporary norms under climates and atmospheric chemistries that no longer exist. In deep time, the boundaries between forest and geology become less neat than schoolbook diagrams imply. Plant matter becomes fuel, wood becomes quartz, wetland becomes seam, trunk becomes karst. Entire landscapes of growth are compressed into categories people call resources. The more the Earth recycles biology into rock, the less absurd it becomes to ask whether some outlier structures may preserve origins the current map no longer captures. There is also a linguistic clue, small but revealing. Many of the oldest names attached to dramatic formations do not come from laboratories. They come from people who live beside them. At Devil's Tower, many indigenous names reference the bear and a lodge or tipi-like form. Those names do not endorse the tree stump theory. They do something subtler. They remind us that striking landforms are first interpreted by shape, relation, and presence, not by later technical mechanism. Official naming often arrives through military surveys, land offices, or extractive mapping. One layer describes what something resembles, another declares what it is. Over time, the second layer becomes authoritative, and the first is filed away as folklore. But resemblance is not worthless. It is often the first data the human mind records. Skeptics will say, correctly, that resemblance can mislead. Clouds look like faces. Coastlines look like veins. People are built to detect patterns, sometimes too eagerly. That caution is necessary. Yet skepticism has two directions. It should challenge extraordinary claims, but it should also challenge the comfort of ordinary ones. If the accepted explanation for a formation remains partly unresolved, if the object shares a precise morphology with known biological forms, if petrification of wood is unquestionably real, if ancient biomass exceeded modern expectation, and if institutions sought evidence into compartments that rarely speak to one another, then a controlled re-examination is not irrational, it is overdue. The real danger is not that people ask the wrong question, it is that they stop asking once a label is attached. And once a label is attached, economics begins to harden it. Landscapes become timber, or monument, reserve, or hazard. Budgets follow category. Research follows budget. And a site identified as an igneous intrusion will attract one kind of expertise and one kind of instrumentation. A site identified as petrified organic architecture would attract another. Reclassification is expensive. It complicates textbooks, museum signage, legal definitions, grant pathways, and the reputations of the people who signed the previous reports. No secret chamber is required. Bureaucracy is enough. Inertia is enough. A strange possibility can remain untouched for decades simply because no institution gains by being the first to look seriously and risk finding nothing. What remains, then, is not a solved mystery, but an uneven record. There is living proof that trees can reach scales most people would call unbelievable. There is fossil proof that wood can turn to stone while preserving form. There is geological proof that columned rock can mimic organic structures with unnerving precision. There are isolated formations whose shapes still provoke the same reaction from first-time observers. Not mountain, not cliff, not ridge, but stump. And there is a modern culture so accustomed to reduced forests, managed landscapes, and compressed timelines that deep biological scale now feels more fantastic than deep geological time. That may be the largest distortion of all. So the argument is not that every tower of stone once leafed into the sky, it is that our confidence may exceed our inspection. Some formations are exactly what geology says they are. Some may not be. Some may be records of processes that cross categories long before categories existed. And if a world once held arboreal forms larger than any living forest can teach us to imagine, then the remains would not necessarily survive as would in the ordinary sense. They would survive as mineral, topography, anomaly, and argument. The record is still there. Stand again before the tower at dawn, or before any isolated monolith that seems too deliberate to be accidental, too organic to be comfortably geological, too familiar in shape and too alien in scale. The official explanation may be largely right, it may even be completely right, but if that were the end of the matter, the unease would fade once the label was learned. It does not. The object keeps resisting the sentence placed on it. The silhouette keeps returning, the pattern repeats, and the real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.